This is lecture 6.4 for Psych 440, rating errors. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the cognitive process that we believe raters use to take all of the information they have about performance, put it together, and turn that into a performance rating. And the problem with that is it's a complicated process involving lots of steps. There is possible for error to creep in at each step in that process. So we'll talk about some of the common rating errors that we traditionally worry about, and we'll talk about two different approaches to training raters to work around those errors, and we'll compare and contrast those and talk about how they can be used in organizations. So just to get things started, question for you. In fact, the majority of error or bias in ratings is often quite unintentional. There are lots of things that come in that can affect the accuracy of raters' judgments, and in general, we find that it's not necessarily deliberate or intentional. The primary reason that raters seem to make inaccurate ratings is due to reliance on what we call cognitive shortcuts or heuristics, ways to simplify this complicated task of combining a lot of performance information and turning it into a rating. So I want to talk through a model that we often use that describes the cognitive process a rater has to go through. At each step in this process, there are potential things that could come in and interfere with the accuracy of their judgment. So the first step in the process is that in order to rate behavior, the rater has to observe it. This creates room for error because most raters can't be watching everything that an employer does. A supervisor can't stand over every employee's shoulder every minute of the workday, so they're going to miss some important behaviors naturally. There's also potential for bias right here at the observation stage. We know from lots of cognitive psychology research that human beings tend to see what we expect to see. So if we believe an employee tends to be a pretty good employee, we're going to be more likely to notice their positive behaviors, and we might not even see their negative behaviors. If we believe that someone is typically a poor employee, we might not even notice their effective performance behaviors. So when we have error creep in at this stage, that's going to affect everything later on. We can't evaluate behavior we didn't even see in the first place. The next step from a cognitive perspective is we have to encode that information. We have to think about how we're going to store it in our memory. We've got to process it in some way. And this might be interpreting a behavior as negative or positive. We can make errors in how we code that information. We could see a behavior and mistakenly remember it as being a very positive behavior when it wasn't. Or we might not think about a behavior well enough. We might not be paying enough attention to it to encode it for storage, which is the next step in the process. If we want to remember things, we have to store it in our memory. This is not a process we have a lot of conscious control over, but nevertheless, there's room for error here. We might store information incorrectly. We might, for example, notice a really positive behavior, but remember it as coming from the wrong employee. We might fail to remember some information that's relevant, like the context of a situation. We might remember an employee reacting very negatively to a customer and forget to remember that there weren't any customers present, which might be really important context. We store information, and then with a formal performance appraisal process, that typically only takes place once a year, maybe twice a year. So we have to keep that information in our memory until it's appraisal time, and then we have to retrieve it. And there's room for error at the retrieval stage as well. We might have stored the information correctly, but we might retrieve it wrong. Or we might fail to retrieve all of the information we have. We might simply forget about some of the behaviors that we noticed early on. And then finally, when we've retrieved the information that we think is relevant, we have to integrate it, we have to put it together, and use it to come up with our overall rating. At this stage, we might, if we didn't do well in the earlier stages, we might not have the information we need. We might be missing pieces that we would want to take into account. Or we might choose at this point to disregard or discount some of that information, which would lead to a biased decision. So you can see that there are lots of places in here that error can creep in, lots of places that the rating process can go wrong. Over the years, we've also identified a number of specific ways in which those could go wrong. And some of these correspond differently than others to different stages in the process. One very common type of error that we talk about quite a bit, I'll give the general title of distributional errors. And that's because these errors look a little bit different on the surface, but they stem from the same problem. In all of these errors, raters aren't really using the whole rating scale. Their ratings aren't distributed across the whole spectrum. Leniency error is when everyone is rated fairly high, so raters only use kind of the top part of the rating scale. A severity bias is when everyone is rated fairly low, and then a central tendency bias would be when you tend to rate everyone in the middle, with nobody being outstandingly good or bad. This corresponds to that last stage in the rating process, where you might be disregarding some information or using that information in a biased way. If you tend to believe that all of your employees are good, you might tend to have a leniency bias. If you tend to say, well, most of my employees are average, you have to be really outstanding to get a good rating from me, you're biasing your ratings in the direction of central tendency. One of the tricky things about distributional errors is that you can't always tell from someone's ratings whether they're committing one. It's quite possible for all the employees in a work group to be pretty good, or for all of them to be pretty much average. So just because ratings tend to cluster in a particular area of the spectrum doesn't tell you for sure that a distributional error is going on. There is some research that suggests that the tendency to be lenient or severe is related to personality traits. People who are very highly agreeable tend to rate people more leniently. People who are low in agreeableness tend to commit more severity bias. But it's very hard to tease out, it's very hard to say with certainty that something is a function of distributional error and not really a property of the people being rated. The problem with distributional errors, and the reason that we worry about them, is that they make it hard to distinguish, or the technical term here we use is discriminate, not in the sense of illegal discrimination, but in the sense of making good distinctions between good performers and poor performers. Everybody comes out rated about the same, whether their performance is the same or not. That makes it very hard to use that information to make decisions or to really understand how other things might relate to job performance. When we talk about validating predictors of job performance later on, we're going to talk about an issue of restriction of range. It's hard to see correlations between things if there's not much variance in one of them. So distributional errors mean we don't have a lot of variance. Everybody's very similar. It's hard to see patterns and relationships. Another major category of error that we worry about, this one tends to creep in at earlier stages in that cognitive process. It's called halo error, and it occurs when one characteristic of a ratee kind of spills over and influences the way we rate them on all of the different dimensions. So for example, if you have an employee with very, very good interpersonal skills, when you think about that employee, you picture them and their great interpersonal skills, and so then maybe rather than thinking really critically about their performance in other areas, you make assumptions that they're also very detail-oriented and that they're very knowledgeable about the job, when those things might not actually be true. You're aware of one really strong characteristic, and so it colors your perceptions of everything else. The research on halo error has argued about two different possible processes or causes that are going on here. One is that raters kind of start out making a general evaluation of performance, and then they transfer that and use that to rate all of the different dimensions. So they're not really thinking about interpersonal skills versus job knowledge versus attention to detail. They're just thinking, yeah, this is a good employee, so therefore they must be good at everything. Or sometimes there's an argument that this process is a little bit more intentional, that the rater doesn't want to distinguish between dimensions, doesn't want to put that effort in, so they pick one thing and base all of their ratings on that thing. This is problematic because it's harder to give good developmental feedback, it's hard to identify real behavioral strengths and weaknesses. Each person is just kind of one number here, and it sort of undoes all that work we did to develop good multidimensional performance criteria. We end up with just kind of this overall number that doesn't necessarily tell us what an employee is doing well or doing poorly. It's also difficult because people don't necessarily have highly defined patterns. Not everybody has one thing they're really good at and one thing they're terrible at. Some employees might actually be pretty good at everything. Other employees might actually be pretty poor at everything. So just like you can't necessarily tell by looking at ratings that a rater is engaging in leniency or severity, you can't tell by any one employee's ratings that a rater is engaging in lots of halo error either. It might be true halo where they really are similar on all the aspects. Other commonly discussed, commonly worried about errors include timing errors, and these can work in either direction. We see recency effects. What have you done for me lately? Maybe there was one incident of poor performance in the week right before the appraisal that pulls the ratings down very far compared to months and months of good performance. On the flip side of that, you can have a first impression error, where your very early initial impressions of a ratee influence how you perceive and evaluate them from then on. First impression errors can creep in at those very early stages of the cognitive process model. If you expect someone to be a good employee, you're more likely to notice their good behavior. If someone made a bad first impression, you're more likely to notice their mistakes than you are their good performance. And so either the earliest or the most recent examples of behavior tend to have more sway over ratings than all of the behaviors that happened in between. And finally, we do see effects of similarity or liking. Ratings tend to be higher for people who are similar to the rater in some characteristic. There's been a lot of research looking at this in terms of demographic characteristics. There's some slight evidence that sometimes men tend to rate men higher, or women tend to rate women higher. If you have lots of other performance information, those effects tend to go away, but there can be more subtle similarity effects as well. For example, if someone went to the same university as their supervisor, or shares a particular hobby or interest in common, we tend to rate ourselves positively, and so we tend to believe that people who are like us have good characteristics. So those kinds of similarity biases can be very subtle and very sneaky and hard to identify. So, what can we do about it? Well, we talked about in the last lecture, that changing the rating form doesn't help a whole lot, but the way we train raters can reduce the frequency of these errors. In fact, one of the most common methods of rater training is called error training. If you make raters aware of these errors, you can give some practical tips to combat them. For example, make sure that you're not tuning out in the middle of the performance period. Document performance as you go so that you're not influenced too much by a first impression or by a recency bias. Each of these errors, making people aware of each of these errors does seem to help. The danger here is there's also some evidence that if you really do a great job with your rater error training, raters may overcorrect. For example, if you have an employee who really is pretty good at everything, but you've really drilled the idea of halo error into your raters' heads, they might be so anxious to avoid looking like they were committing a halo error that they might alter their ratings so that they no longer reflected true performance. They might create some weaknesses that don't really exist and overcorrect. Another strategy for training raters comes from a very different perspective. Frame of reference training is designed to get all raters on the same page so that they're looking for the same behaviors, they're interpreting those behaviors in the same way, and then they're evaluating and rating those behaviors in the same way. So frame of reference training would start very early on saying, these are the behaviors to look for, this is what you should be tracking. When you see this behavior, this is how you should interpret it. It's a positive indicator of communication skills. It's a negative indicator of attention to detail. In frame of reference training, there's usually a lot of practice and discussion and feedback. You might watch lots of videos or reenactments of job performance, and then discuss, what did everybody see? Are we all seeing the same things? How do we evaluate what we saw? The idea being that after lots of this practice, the raters get to be calibrated so that it shouldn't matter anymore if you're rated by Bob or Thomas or Susan. They're all going to see the same things, they're all going to interpret behavior in the same way. On the whole, research suggests that both error training and frame of reference training can be very effective. In fact, they tend to be most effective when you use them together. And so a very good practice for combating rater error in performance appraisal is to somehow incorporate both of these types of training for the people who will be doing those appraisals. In the next lecture, we will talk about, once you've made those performance ratings, what do you do with them? How do you deliver that performance appraisal information?